Hey there, tourists! Welcome inside Old House. We're your guides, Sandy and Sky, and today we'll be talking about hide and seek and the document B12 Show. Our usual disclaimer, please don't listen to episodes until you have finished reading the book. All episodes will contain spoilers from the novel We Used to Live Here, along with the short stories related to the Polterkites expanded universe. Just some housekeeping things. We are so sorry this episode has come out late. You know, it was a combination of getting a cold and then technical difficulties. So this is actually our second time recording this episode. And then just life in general gets busy. So sorry, but here we are. Let's hope this one works and we don't have to record it for a third time.
Old House just doesn't want us doing this. Yeah. I'm going to go with that.
Oh my goodness.
Or the archivists. Probably the archivists more likely.
Maybe they're sabotaging us a little bit. They're saying too much information. We got to quiet them a bit. Anyway, chapter 3, hide and seek. Just a bit of a synopsis. This chapter is fairly short and it's just about Thomas and Eve's search for Jenny in the basement. It's 9 pages long and everything about it is creepy and unsettling, and I think I dislike this chapter more the second time. Or like the more that I read it, the more I dislike it. It's not great. I mean, great writing. It's just not, it doesn't make me feel good.
It's great writing because it makes you feel unsettled and kind of like eerie.
Yes, exactly.
That perfect sort of wrongness.
Yes. There is suspense in this chapter. There are jump scares, and I was pretty happy for it to be over. Not gonna lie. So here we go. The first thing that stuck out to me in this chapter is the narrow hallway that branched off in 2 directions. Every time I think of the basement, I think of how much of a maze or labyrinth it is, and I tell myself I should try to map it out, like on paper. I never have. Even though this is our second time recording, I still haven't. And I'm also watching Severance right now on Apple TV, and it reminded me of how Petey was mapping out the layout of their workspace behind the group photo, which is also in like a downstairs basement area. So it was giving me kind of similar vibes.
I still need to watch that, but it does
it's pretty
sound
good.
The way you described it. Liminal spaces and basements just go hand in hand.
Yeah. Have you thought of actually creating a map based on the basement descriptors, Sky?
I was actually doing this the other day. When I was rereading the chapter again for this episode, when my doctor was late, and so I was just sitting with a notebook rereading the sections. I was like, I wonder if I could do this. And you can actually make a pretty decent layout based on the information provided just in this chapter. Mm-hmm. There are like directionalities. This hallway turns left. There's a room full of shelves. The vent is blowing on her left shoulder. I don't think we could build it. I don't think it was necessarily intentional for us to be able to use this information to build a layout for a purpose. But it was really, really fun. And a lot of the information I used wasn't explicitly told. Like, it's never said that Eve doubled backed at any point, but Thomas is ahead of her later in the chapter, which means either when they split up, they meet back up, or Thomas maybe can go through walls. We don't actually know. So
we don't know.
It's all guesswork. I'll have to post my favorite layouts at some point, though.
Yeah, please do. Because I'm such a visual person, so like the Old House map in the front was great. I loved it. And this, I'm just like reading it over and over, and I'm like, oh, I wish I could just have a map in front of me.
Yes.
So I can kind of like follow along. Like, where is Eve right now? Where is this creepy room?
Maybe that's how the guides got started with all of their maps that they have.
Oh, maybe actually. It's just a bunch of like makeshift stuff on the walls.
Just like watching through everyone's eyes to figure out different places in the same old house.
Right. That would be cool, actually. So the basement gives me an eerie feeling right away, with an unusual heaviness to the dark down here, as if it were soaking up the light, hoarding it away from some unknown purpose. And it actually kind of sounds like something Mo might say to Eve. There's some foreshadowing here, and it's a little bit creepy. But not only that, Thomas studied the shadows with apprehension, almost like there might be something dangerous out there.
Yeah.
If you weren't fond of basements before, you surely will be terrified of them after reading this. So no thank you. Kudos to you for going down there, even though she didn't want to. You're braver than me.
Something else I really, really loved about this section in particular was the descriptors metallic like a mouthful of pennies
Yes.
and sour like bark mulch after a rainstorm when describing the smell of the basement, which this was just almost like an intense reaction from me because I was like, oh my gosh, I have smelled that exact thing before. This basement, I don't think doesn't just have structural integrity issues. I think that it's actually literally rotting in some way. Just a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in any of this, so don't take my words for any diagnosis of strange smells that you experience. But to me, it smells like what mold smells like. I was infected with black mold from a place I was staying at during the pandemic, but I know that like dry rot smells similar to these descriptions as well. This paragraph like picked me up and tossed me back into the memories of getting sick. It was kind of funny. I don't think it's a coincidence that Marcus used this very specific descriptions, coupling with it with the comment that it had sunk into the beams. I think the house might have dry rot, which is what most basements, old basements have, and it wouldn't shock me if Marcus went into a basement to find descriptors to write into this section. It was a really weird and very rambly paragraph, but basically Marcus made it very good at setting the scene for being creepy visually and with descriptors like smell.
And we know that Marcus does a lot of research for his books, so I would not be surprised if he did that.
Yeah. It's a good question.
So near the end of the chapter, Thomas knocks again onto a nearby pipe, and Jenny responds with 2 faint knocks that echoed in response, and those knocks were on the brick. So was she back in Old Eve's house now? Was she responding from a different old house that she's stuck in and can't get back? It makes me wonder because, like, how she comes upstairs later on and she's like, sorry, in communion?
Yeah.
That behavior for a kid doesn't seem like the behavior of a child that just played hide and seek. Like, I feel like she realized, especially if we think that Jenny grew up in Old House, I feel like she realized, oh no, I've done something. I'm so sorry. And that was the type of feel I got from that chapter. But I mean, I could be completely wrong. Like, what do you think?
I think there's a lot layered into that. I talk about it. I talk about it. We haven't recorded communion yet, but I've been writing. We're getting prepared for that one. Some stuff actually, when I was rereading communion, I found interesting about that section. I agree. I don't think that it was just like, oh, I'm sorry I did this. I think there's a lot more to it than that. With the section that you just talked about, I do think the dumbwaiter specifically is important. I don't think anything on any of the websites is a coincidence. Yeah. Everything should be intentional until it's proven otherwise, especially when it ties directly into the story like that commented. As for Jenny saying and repeating sorry, I have some thoughts on that, but nothing concrete. Maybe she saw the same terrifying visions Eve sees in the basement, which would be even worse for a kid. What if this Jenny is coming back from her mother's murder? Or if the transition between old houses is just horrific? I'll touch on this a little bit in the next episode, but I think it's interesting that there's a loud boom from outside right before she comes upstairs. Thomas immediately explains it away as a fallen tree, and that's the moment Jenny comes up saying she's sorry.
Oh.
And I was like,
yeah.
I just took it as a tree, but they never talk about a fallen tree, I don't think. And that would have been a close tree to be that loud. I'm wondering if that was her return to Old House.
Yeah.
Was that noise.
And like to just chalk it up to a fallen tree when you haven't even investigated.
Exactly.
It's almost like he's hiding something. Like he's trying to brush it off so that Eve and Charlie don't become suspicious.
I think that's something to it. And if the transition between old houses for maybe specific people, like if Jenny and Thomas are different in some way, I recently read something, and I can't remember where I read it. It said that madness isn't about not understanding something. It's about briefly comprehending something you shouldn't be able to, like with stories with eldritch beings. Imagine this. If an ant walks through a house, and while it has no idea what humans are, for a brief moment, it can sense what we do. Emotions, thoughts, the meaning behind the words in a book. Then it snaps back to its normal instinctual life, still feeling those echoes of that understanding, but unable to grasp it again. Maybe Jenny moving between old houses experiences something she shouldn't have understood, and repeating sorry and going into almost like a panic attack is her way of coping with those memories that she can no longer fully comprehend.
I think that could be true. Yeah. The next part brings me back to the basement layout, and the basement's bigger than you'd think. Is a passage from the book, and it goes beyond the edges of the upstairs footprint. So do they mean like into other basements of different old houses? Thomas says there's lots of nooks and crannies. I think there's more to it though. He knows about the doors that lead into hallways, into hospitals, and potentially underground shopping malls. He's hinting at it. And on first read, you just don't know it yet, but you discover these things as you continue reading on with the book. And do you remember how we were talking about Thomas saying some contradicting things in our last episode on Memory Lane? Well, it happens again. He tells Eve, if you see Jenny on the move, just run after her, grab her. First of all, I would be uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, just grabbing another person's child, especially of a family I don't know. But later on in the chapter, Thomas says, good luck getting her out without some kicking and screaming, Jenny's a biter. And Eve even notices the odd and contradictory part of this. I don't know what's up with Thomas. I still think he's a good guy, but it's weird. I think he may be mixing up old houses potentially, kind of like how Jenny mixes up even Emma. There might be something there where it's just their old houses are blending and they're not able to keep track. I don't know.
That is a good question. I 1,000% agree about not being comfortable grabbing a child in this situation. I mean, if Jenny was just running by me in a house, I would have been like, okay, I'll put my arm out and grab you, child. But dragging a child out of a dumbwaiter or a wall? No, thank you. But I don't think it's just Eve's house's structural integrity that's rotting a little bit. The way that Thomas acts in this book makes me think he's a solid host that has been a host way too long. I think that the confusion and the contradictions is showing that his brain is not handling the distinction as well anymore. He's trying really, really hard to hold on, thus the medicine, but it could just be a Band-Aid over the problem, but it's concerning to say the least.
It just, when you said that, it reminded me of like dementia as we get older and we get like Alzheimer's or vascular dementia and we start to forget things or things blend. And you're right. He may just be, or you know, the other thing is when you have just so much in your brain and it just starts to pour out, like you can only hold so much.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that. Who knows? That's
one of the worst things is knowing you know something and not remembering it, especially if it was something important to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the worst part is when you have these moments of lucidity and then you are confused. And in those moments, you realize that you're confused. Yeah. Oh, I can't imagine. But enough about that. There's more description of the basement next. And we know Thomas goes left and Eve goes right. And as she rounds a corner, she enters a room that's the size of a 2-car garage, which... that's pretty big, in my opinion. Like how, I mean, I don't know how big this Victorian house is, but I mean, a room just the size of a 2-car garage, pretty big. Don't know what it's for.
It's not that big of a house. It's 2,700 square feet or something along those lines.
Is that what it was? I can't remember. So
it's a big house for sure, but it's not like.
But that's what the 2
Victorian
floors,
mansion.
27. Yeah, it's not like, yeah, that's big. It's big. And in this room, there's 4 rows of rickety shelves that lined the space, crammed with boxes, and the floor was covered with plywood over hard-packed dirt. So there's your dirt again.
All the dirt.
And just as you're trying to bring this image of the described layout of this room into your head as you're reading this, and you're trying to bring it to life, something clatters to the ground. A tin can with nails and screws. They're still moving. So Eve makes another good point. How did it fall? If Thomas went the other way and she's gone this way, and there's no one else supposed to be here. And here's when we're first introduced to Occam's razor. And we will continue to see this throughout our Old House journey.
Both in the book and outside.
Yeah.
I want to know what Mo is going to say before Eve explains the can falling away. If I remember correctly, Mo started to say something before Eve was like, no.
She shuts that down.
Just fell. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a bit of a coping mechanism too, that she's using Charlie's. Like, the most reasonable, the most obvious explanation is probably the right explanation, but still. In this house, you just never know.
That's true.
And then she sees it, this thin trail of tiny black dots, more ants, and they were spilling out from the crack in the plywood. Is it safe to assume they were coming from the dirt underneath? At the start of Labyrinth, they were spotted filing down from a crack in the nearby support beam, another piece of wood. But they met the dirt floor and veered off. So is there something with dirt or wood? They're mentioned as black dots swarming windows and doors in a painting in spiral. Again, in Labyrinth, circling Charlie during the most disturbing and frightening scene in this book. And lastly, in Old Wounds, when Emma sees a solitary ant wandering in an aimless circle on the white stucco ceiling. I'm talking about the ants again here, even though we talked about them in the last episode, because I do think there's something about them. Do they grow out of old houses like magnets grow out of a rotting wound, potentially? Mm-hmm. In modern medicine, magnets are actually used to debride or remove dead tissue from wounds, so they're used as a treatment, and a good thing. But
I like that.
Do ants have a similar function in Old House? Especially after the scene with Charlie, like, are they potentially infesting though? Like, I don't know. It's gross though. And if they're Gelsheimer ants, could they possibly behave differently than the common ants we know and are aware of in our reality?
Yeah.
The ants are brought up again a few more times in this chapter, and I'm just going to go over them now. At the end of page 34, they're noted again. Eve sees the trail of ants moving across the zesty floor, curving around yet another far corner, and they slip under the bone white door. Then, at the end of page 35, she sees the last of them receding underneath the wardrobe. They go straight to the corner, amassing over a crack between the tiles, and moved with delirious urgency, writhing and crawling over one another as they force their way through. Where are they going, and why are they so, eager to get there?
These ants, I swear, they just live rent free in my brain. My first wild theory, I think, on the Reddit was comparing the ants to Old House. And if anyone's interested, that's probably posted way back at the beginning somewhere. I had a whole table set up listing the similarities between them, including an ant's nest acting similarly to Old House. It's pretty fun. I'm going to try not to ramble too much. I have so many questions about these ants. Why are they different than normal house ants, which is mentioned in Hoax? Did they start as regular ants and then change after being in Old House? Do they go through the stages like humans, becoming tourist ants and ending up as host ants eventually? Do they have anchor ants? So many questions here.
So many.
But starting with the real part, ants in Old House are this species shouldn't be here moment. Mm-hmm. If you found a trail of ants in your house, would you just ignore it, or would you try to follow it to see where it leads? I think that these ants were specifically meant to lead Eve to the wardrobe and to the wet bone white door and the fleshy pink room intentionally. Mm-hmm. That room specifically feels like the heart of the basement, where the walls are almost thinnest between the old houses, and that's why it has the paintings that shouldn't exist in her world. Old House needs Eve to be curious, confused, and searching for answers, and who better to lead her to breadcrumbs than ants?
Yeah.
But more than just a literal things, I think that ants are symbolism. Humans are like ants to whatever created the old houses. This has been hinted at in the subreddit, especially with mods using the ant emoji. Mm-hmm. And I think it ties into what I said before about ants briefly understanding things they can't fully grasp. I believe that old houses' old gods are eldritch beings, in a sense, and humans are trying to understand them. But old house is playing with us like ants trapped in different scenarios. Some houses are kinder, like the one with the human who doesn't realize they're the only human there.
Right, yeah.
And others are more sinister, like Eve's house. Though I do think Eve was intentionally chosen to be a ritual placement, so her situation may be even different than normal humans who end up trapped in Old House. Either way, ants are important both literally and symbolically in Eve's world.
I agree. And I think we'll keep talking about these ants as they come up throughout the book, and maybe just keep adding in anything else that we are uncovering or wondering about. And if you have any questions, hey, add them in. There's tons of them for the ants.
Yes.
All right. Has anybody started sketching yet? Because there's more. There's more about the basement. So Eve ends up in another narrow hallway, and this one has green doors on either side. It runs for about 20 feet and then forks right and left. This basement is confusing, and I don't know about you guys, but I feel like lost just reading this. And if I would, I don't think I'd find my way back. I'd be like, where am I going? Where's the main stairs? Get me out of here. And then I'd panic.
You need one of those strings to drag along like a labyrinth.
Yes. So I can find my way back, or breadcrumbs, ants, please lead me back. As I mentioned, the green doors, this is the 6th occurrence of green so far in the book, and we'll kind of keep dropping those tidbits. Let's talk about those blinking eyes next. Eve sees through the shutter of the wardrobe. This is a pretty startling scene. It makes my heart jump just a bit. And I'm not sure if there was really anything there, or if Eve's use of Occam's razor is really appropriate in this case. But it's startling. It's unnerving, to say the least. I would want to get out of there.
It's pretty creepy. And I understand why Eve thought those eyes belonged to Jenny. It seems like a logical place for a child to hide, more so than crawling inside a wall.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been my first choice as a child, I don't think. Oh, maybe if it was... maybe I would have. Who knows? I do think Eve saw eyes, but I think that she was actually seeing her own eyes. I believe that they were the Eve who was hiding in the wardrobe later, watching Allison enter the room. I think this is an example of the walls being between old houses being thinnest at the heart, or maybe it's the only anchor for all the versions of Eve's house, the thing it can rebuild from. Like how cobra lilies can regenerate from just a piece of a root after a fire. Maybe this room is the one constant across all of the versions. And that's why things like the pegboard and painting are there.
You know what that just reminded me of when you said that? The Harry Potter in Prisoner of Azkaban, my favorite book, by the way.
Me too.
But you know how they go back in time, and when you first go through it, there's like little tidbits where they're like, what the heck is that? But it's just themselves, but they just don't realize it. That's kind of what it just reminded me of.
That's a good point. It's pretty much exactly it.
Yeah. And you're right. I think that could be it. That's a really good point, that it could just be Eve looking at herself from a different part. You mentioned the paintings, and this is the first time that we're introduced to the paintings in the basement. And this one is of Chocolate Lab, which we can presume is Buckley, facing the woods with his tail straight and ears pricked up, sensing some unseen threat. So it kind of goes along with that theme of something's going on, we're not quite sure, there's an unwanted presence, it's a bit threatening. And the red gas lantern that shows up throughout the book is also noted in the painting. This is another very eerie part of the chapter. Everything about this part of the book is unsettling. So do you remember how we mentioned we don't really know that much about Eve, particularly what she looks like? Well, one of the few things we do know about her is that she used to go to art school. And this detail is so brief, you can easily miss it on the first few reads, actually.
Yeah, it also potentially ties into Vera also being an artist, like carving the horses and the flowers into the banister.
Yeah.
Vera does the paintings. There seem to be a lot of connections between those two as well. You mentioned the eerie feeling also, and just made me think that there are so many good descriptors really making us feel uneasy in this basement that I think any other point in the book, even if the descriptions aren't as vivid as this one, it leaves us with that same feeling of remembering the feelings we felt in this chapter, which is really good, like, psychological writing.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, setting it up so this room really makes us feel uneasy. So when every other time, it heightens our anxiety when she's in the basement.
Yes, exactly. It just makes it worse. Oh, so good job, Marcus. Your writing is working. Finally, Eve leaves that creepy room, but as she steps around the corner, she sees Thomas. His posture is pinned straight, his arms hanging limp. His flashlight, white-knuckled gripped in his left hand, was pointed straight down at the floor. This still posture is not quite the cross pose we hear about later in the book, but it's still strange. So when he finally snaps out of it and he has no recollection of Eve even calling his name, he brushes it off as his hearing is poor, which we know that Thomas does a lot of this, as you mentioned earlier with the whole tree, the bang, brushes off. And so he tends to just brush things off and make excuses for them, which I don't think his hearing is poor. But no. And I really feel like these are moments where he could be being possessed by whatever entity is trying to control him. So kind of like the man in the basement when they're looking through their eyes, right? Yeah. So maybe he's in that posture because whatever it is looking through his eyes, checking in on him, making sure that he's, acting or behaving with his best behavior, that he's doing what he's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And when the old man says like, you're not supposed to be here yet, maybe they're on a timeline. Maybe they're checking to be like, hey, are you where you need to be? I don't know.
That makes sense. It could also line up with the being in the same place, or two different versions of yourself being in the same place. Like, what if they didn't realize it was that Eve? They thought it was a different Eve.
Oh, maybe. Creepiness aside, though, Thomas then leads Eve to the opposite side of the basement and says, Jenny is hiding in this small space, just out of view. So I just want to make a note of that quickly. And I don't know why I didn't pick up with this like on the previous times that I've read this, but do we ever have proof that Jenny was hiding in there? We don't see her. And later on, we know the knocks that Jenny replies with are faint and distant and sound like they're on concrete. A part of me is just not convinced that she's even there, and this is just Thomas trying to calm down Eve and again brush it off.
He's really good at that.
Yeah.
Thomas is the master at deflection, but he's also really nervous at this point. After this, the moment when he's acting just like when Andrew found Peter, he seemed to be at least genuinely concerned for Jenny, tugging at his collar nervously and everything. Perhaps that was also like being shaken after being taken over by something, like being snapped back into your own body. I do think Jenny is already gone by this point. I do think that she took the dumbwaiter to another old house and is not in this basement currently with Eve and Thomas. Even when they hear the knocks, I'm not sure they're from Jenny. Maybe all of the basements are connected and she's far away in another old house, which would explain the faint knocks. Or maybe it's something else trying to convince Eve that Jenny's really here so that she doesn't go and call the cops when they can't find her. I would have called the cops and the fire department the second a stranger's child crawled into my walls. But that's just me.
Too easy.
Yeah, right? But the house seems to be stronger in the basement than anywhere else, so it wouldn't surprise me if it could somehow manipulate the space to create those knocks, like knocking over a can.
Yeah, it could be something else. The same thing that knocked over the can could be the same thing knocking back at Thomas.
Yep.
Who knows? And you can tell Eve just wants this to be over because she offers to crawl into that small space and get her. And I personally would not do such a thing. Just saying. Not just because I wouldn't want to grab someone else's child, but because like I wouldn't say that I'm claustrophobic necessarily, but crawling into that tiny space and not knowing what's over there either, it just being all unfamiliar, no, you would not find me crawling in that space. So kudos to actually like firefighters and stuff that do that to rescue people. And this is where Thomas contradicts himself again, which I mentioned earlier about Jenny's behavior and the biting. This pretty much ends the chapter. We already spoke about Jenny's knock-knock response that I'm not entirely convinced was her, and neither is Skye. Thomas is content with this, though, and convinces Eve time is what Jenny needs, and they head back upstairs. Reluctantly, Eve heads back upstairs with Thomas, and I'm sure she was just glad to get out of the basement. And before we end this episode, we're just going to go over the document B12 show. This was an advert from the Yale Courier. There isn't much here in this point of the book, but the Ring of Eyes band does help tie into Elijah and Michael later on. This is obviously from decades ago because the cover is 50 cents, which, I mean, I don't even know what you can get for 50 cents anymore. Like nothing.
Nothing.
I don't think you get anything.
I think this is also the first and it may have been intended to be this, the first direct contradiction to Thomas's descriptions of his father. The father he describes does not seem like one to start a metal band like this, and this could be setting us up as Thomas being an unreliable narrator in the Faust family.
You know what it just reminds me of too is, remember later on when Eve sees the multiple paintings and they're all kind of different, like there's different families and some are happy and some are grumpy, and one is with the old house on fire, and like maybe it's like the same people living the same life, quote unquote, but like in different old houses, and so they're just a tad bit different, and maybe they're happening at the same time and they're getting mixed up, and that's why Thomas is getting mixed up. I don't know what I'm saying.
That actually has some merit. If one of my theories right now is that these are all almost like little experiments, thus the one human with no other humans in the old house. If they had like groups of people and they're like, okay, you finished this scenario and died or whatever, ended up back in the lowest basements of old house. So we're going to pick you up and put you in a different scenario and see what you do with this.
Yeah.
And that could be the different families in that old house. Is this them choosing different already captured humans to put in and see what they do in the same situation?
Yeah, because even if you think of like the Thomas and Paige in Eve's old house and then the Thomas and Paige in Emma's old house, there are differences there. And so maybe the Elijah and the Michael and the Heather are also different in Eve and Emma's old house.
Goodness, so hard not to go down the rabbit hole. But yeah, Michael has passed away in Eve's old house, but in Emma's, Elijah was seen alive.
Yeah, Michael was seen alive.
Or did I say Elijah? Sorry, not Elijah. Michael was...
Yes.
We had talked about both of them. Michael was passed away. They both were in Eve's house. And Michael was seen alive at the end with Heather. Thank you for correcting me on that.
Yes, that's exactly. I just wonder. And so when we have these documents, we don't know what their labeling system is yet. So B12 is that, it's a good point. Someone else brought this up and I agree with them. Like maybe the A, B, C, whatever, E are different old houses. And so this document could be from an old house where Elijah does have hobbies and Thomas is just remembering his version of old house where his father did not like hobbies.
I think so. I think we're in the E one because everything we've gotten so far has been from the E, from the photos to the document about the basement, the cellars. So I think that's where we are.
Which is Eve's timeline, because if you look at E25 help, when Charlie is looking for Eve, that is Eve's timeline.
Exactly. So there's a lot of evidence towards that. I'm kind of like, that's my top theory. Nothing is concrete, though, even if it's been confirmed. So.
Honestly, it can change. It can change. Marcus might get another idea, and he's going to be like, oh, that was a good one. I'm going to steal that.
It's the fun part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the last thing I noted was the time it starts, which was 7 p.m. And I don't think there's much to it. The only reason I mention is because Spirited Away started at 7 p.m. as well in the document C15 movie. And again, it's probably nothing. This is a common time for movies to start or like events to start. But just thought I'd mention it because I was like, oh, it's not like 7 or 8. They're both 7. So I was just like, is there something there? Maybe just take note of it.
Everything's important until proven otherwise.
Yes, exactly. All right. Well, I think that's it. This was a quick one. The next one's going to be long, guys. It's going to be long. There's a lot in Communion. We're probably going to split it into 2. Give us some time. We want to make sure that we research this properly and make the episode as good as we can. So bear with us. Thanks for waiting so far with this one. And I think that's it.
I think so. So this has been your guide, Sandy and Sky, and we'll see you next time. First,
see ya.